Deciding to call my channel Sega Lord X comes with some caveats. There are some that will take it as that I'm trying to call myself some kind of authority on Sega related content. Others see it as I'm some blind fanboy that believes Sega can do no wrong, or worse, that I have only ever played Sega games and systems. Well, of course none of that is true, and in this video we are going to go over my favorite systems that didn't have a Sega logo somewhere on it. I hope you guys enjoy my top 10 non-Sega systems. The 3DO was an interesting experiment back in 1993. The 3DO company didn't actually make anything. They designed the hardware and then licensed that hardware to other businesses to make. It cost too much, the makers of the hardware weren't ready to support it properly with software, and it only lasted a few years. But I can honestly say that I enjoyed my time with the 3DO quite a bit. Because it came out only a few years before the Saturn and PlayStation in North America, it was a preview of what the 5th generation of consoles was about to offer. The library, while not bursting at the seams, still offered plenty to play in its short life. Being able to fire up games like Super Street Fighter II Turbo, Road Rash, and Need for Speed had been a heck of a treat in those early days. It isn't fondly remembered by those that played it after the fact, but for me, 1993 and 94 were a hell of a lot more fun because of it. If I had to pick a favorite game for the 3DO, it'd be Road Rash. It had a soundtrack from the gods, looked incredible, and easily was one of the best racing experiences a home system had ever conjured. It's true that the PlayStation and Saturn versions run at much better frame rates, but the 3DO version here still sounds great and, more importantly, plays great. If you ever decide to give the 3DO a chance, this is a game you have to have. The Nintendo Entertainment System. Most of you have a ton of experience with this one, and so do I. This was the very first game system at home I ever found worth my time. I had not been a fan of systems like the Odyssey or the Atari 2600, always feeling like they stripped away the very essence of the arcade games much of their software was based on. The NES changed all of that for me, giving me games that looked, played, and sounded excellent. Like many of you, I was bitten by the Super Mario bug early on, and then the hits just kept coming. Here is where I came to love platformers like Castlevania, run and guns like Contra, adventure games like Zelda, and RPGs like Final Fantasy. From 1986 to 1989, my life was the NES. It brought me closer to my friends and made me a better gamer with its brutally difficult games. I'll never forget it, and its impact on gaming as a whole was absolutely huge. With my love of Castlevania being what it is, you'd think that my favorite game on the NES would be one of the original trilogy. Well, you'd be wrong, because my favorite NES game is Tecmo's Rygar. It's a Metroid-style adventure game where you need to upgrade your stats and items to get to areas of the world you couldn't access before. It has a killer soundtrack, great graphics, and is one of the system's most grossly underrated games. My experience with the Neo Geo was limited to the arcade for years. I didn't have the money to buy the system and its games at any point in my youth. Even when I got older, I made the choice to go with the Neo Geo CD to keep costs down to a manageable level. I still loved many of its games though. The vast majority of my experience with this hardware came in the form of multiplayer gaming. Me and my buds played Samurai Showdown and Fatal Fury until our fingers bled. Despite being known as a system with a ton of fighting games, I found many of its sports games to be excellent as well. The Baseball Stars games were ace, and Neo Turf Masters is my favorite golf game ever. There were a bunch of great shoot-'em-ups too. Games like Last Resort and Ghost Pilots were regular arcade trips for me, and later games like Metal Slug were awesome too. I own a consoleized MVS these days with a multi-cart, so I'm able to play anything I want. Despite not owning the hardware until years after its initial release, I still have great memories of the games it spawned. Without a second thought, Neo Turf Masters is my favorite game on the Neo Geo. It's a perfect balance of challenge, gameplay, and fun factor that simply has no equal in the genre. I play it often, and even my daughter loves it. The Neo Geo had a special way of making its games both competitive and fun, and Neo Turf Masters definitely has plenty of both.
Good shot! Fine! Get in!
On the green! Come on, birdie try.
Birdie! I did it!
My first impression of the Nintendo GameCube was overwhelmingly negative. It was a little toy cube with a damn handle on the back that didn't play DVDs. The controller was completely unconventional with its button layout, and it launched with a Luigi game about vacuuming up ghosts. Surely this thing was a joke, right? Well, as it happens, the GameCube turned out to be a pretty dang decent system. That Luigi game wasn't so bad, and it had some contenders for best games of that generation in the form of a couple solid Resident Evil entries, the Rogue Squadron games, and Metroid Prime. While many found it a bit over the top, I loved the Metal Gear Solid remake Twin Snakes as well. For a system that sold a fraction of its direct competition, I think the GameCube library is actually quite strong. It was also here that my love for the Super Monkey Ball games blossomed. The best part of being a GameCube owner was having exclusive access to an improved version of Skies of Arcadia. It was already my favorite Dreamcast game, but here it was rebalanced and had additional content. I still feel that this game has some of the most lovable and relatable characters in any RPG story I've ever been a part of. The friendships and grudges seem real, and by the end you were gutted to see these characters go. If you haven't played Skies of Arcadia, you have missed one hell of a good experience. Despite its absolutely massive library of games and its legendary success in the US, it was the import library of the PlayStation 2 that made me love the system. It had tons of games that never left Japan that I focused much of my buying power on. I didn't need another Tekken or another Final Fantasy at that point, and instead went after stuff like Sega Rally, Sega Ages, and the myriad of other arcade-related Japanese exclusives. Of course, the rest of the library only proved to help matters by offering up must-play games like Onimusha, Rygar, and the Metal Gear Solid games. This system saw so much software it was impossible to stay on top of everything unless you had money falling out of the crack of your ass. It has a huge RPG library. Favorites like Soul Calibur and Contra made multiple showings, and we even got a classic arcade Castlevania in the form of Haunted Castle. When it comes to retro games, the PS2 covers a huge swath of software that easily makes it one of the best systems to collect for. Many of its best games are also still really affordable, rarely costing more than $20 or so. Choosing a favorite among such a massive library would normally be quite hard, but my favorite game on the PlayStation 2 was an experience unlike any other. Virtua Fighter 4 was everything I wanted a new Virtua Fighter to be. It looked exceptional, with great character models and impressive locations to do battle. The gameplay was lightning fast and added a few new fighters to shake up the formula a bit. If that wasn't enough, if you pick up the Evolution release of this game, you get Virtua Fighter 10th Anniversary with it free of charge. a reimagined take on the first game with the gameplay of the fourth. It really was a AAA package and one of Sega's strongest fighting games ever.
Fight 2! Ready? Go! Ho! KO! Ho! Yeah!
While it was beaten to a pulp by the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo in the United States, I came to really enjoy the TurboGrafx 16. Its exclusive games felt quite different from the stuff coming out elsewhere, and I loved the super colorful look and unique sound the system was capable of. The Japanese variant of this, the PC Engine, was far more successful, meaning you had a ton of great import titles to look for. Not only did it get an incredible entry into the Castlevania line with Dracula X, but it also got one hell of a good version of Street Fighter II and Ninja Spirit. The shoot-'em-up genre was well represented with hits like Gate of Thunder and Blazing Lasers, not to mention the countless import shooters you had access to. The RPG, adventure, and strategy games on the system were top-notch as well, represented by staples like East Book 1 and 2, Newtopia 1 and 2, and Military Madness. It even had a handful of solid Sega games that I always appreciated. No matter what you wanted to play, the Turbo had something for you. I had been a major fan of scary movies as a kid, so I was drawn to Splatterhouse instantly because of its theme and visual similarity to the Friday the 13th character Jason Voorhees. The Turbo version knocks it out the park, nailing both the sound and visuals of the arcade on which it's based. It's gory, easy to get into, and has a great atmosphere. The Genesis would get the sequels, but this right here is where it started for me. It's included on the upcoming TurboGrafx Mini, so be sure to check it out. When Sega announced that the Dreamcast was going down in flames, it was a dark day for us all. And who the hell thought it would have been Microsoft of all companies to capture the spirit of Sega so perfectly with its first console ever, the Xbox. I picked this up when it came out because of the hype surrounding Halo, only to be met with countless awesome Sega titles in the process. Sega sports games continued here stronger than ever, and we'd see sequels to popular IPs like Crazy Taxi, Toe Jam and Earl, and Spike Out Battle Street. And the hits just kept coming from Sega. House of the Dead 3 made sure the series lived on, and Panzer Dragoon Orta was worthy of its namesake. Sega's awesome update to Outrun was here in all of its arcade glory, and even saw fit to give us a few new IPs that really made owning the Xbox hardware special. Outside of the Sega software I loved, we also got a ton of great third-party games that tended to look and run better than anywhere else. Metal Gear Solid 2 was here, Onimusha showed up, and it even had a Castlevania game. Tecmo showed up in a big way, giving Xbox devotees the epic fighting game Dead or Alive 3, and a modern take on the NES Classic Ninja Gaiden. Luckily, Microsoft didn't try and rely solely on third parties, and made sure we had exclusives to appreciate like Crimson Skies and Forza Motorsport. The import scene on this one was pretty weak, but the library otherwise is loaded with things to play. It had a great series of racing games called Rally Sport Challenge that sort of were the spiritual successors to the Sega Rally games. This system has the second largest library of games I own in my collection, and is one of the best ones to collect for outside of Sega hardware in my opinion. It's even become an inexpensive retro box capable of emulating many older systems, and the sheer amount of homebrew software is incredible. I know a number of people that build arcade setups around this box to keep costs down to a bare minimum. I won't mince words here. Knights of the Old Republic is the best thing to come out of the Star Wars universe since the original trilogy. It's a powerhouse combination of story, character development, and set pieces all tied together by a universe you know and love. Everything here is treated with the utmost respect for the source material, and the ending has to be one of the most memorable experiences from any game of the era. Absolute gold, this one. There's a lot of folks out there that think because I love the Genesis so much that means I hated the Super Nintendo. Nothing could be further from the truth. While I was loving my Genesis, I found plenty of games on the Super Nintendo to play. Super Castlevania 4 ranks among my favorites, and the 16-bit generation wouldn't have been nearly as awesome as it was without stuff like Super Metroid, Zelda, Yoshi's Island, and Chrono Trigger. I quickly fell in love with its great sound chip and special effects capabilities, all of which gave its library its own unique feel. I never saw the Super Nintendo as a replacement for my Genesis for this very reason. The two systems created distinctly different looking and sounding games, something I came to appreciate over time. Since Nintendo was so late to the 16-bit race, the Super Nintendo here would see a powerful lineup of games later in its life, extending my interest well into my ownership of the Sega Saturn. This is one area I have to concede when it comes to the comparisons to the Genesis. Nintendo handled its transition from system to system far better than Sega. My favorite Super Nintendo game is hands down Super Castlevania 4. It was an early release for the platform, and yet it still managed to look and sound as good as anything else the system produced. Gameplay here is virtually flawless for a 1991 game design. It's tight, allows you to control your character in the air, and offers the best whip control in the entire series. But it was more than these things too. The atmosphere that was created by its haunting soundtrack and locations created a mood when you played it few other games ever came close to. It also showed off Mode 7 effects of the system in cool ways, such as rotating stages and a map screen that zoomed in. It quickly established the Super Nintendo as a system I couldn't ignore, and remains an experience that transcends its age and remains an excellent looking, sounding, and playing experience till this very day. My favorite 5th generation system was hands down the Sega Saturn. Its exclusive games gave me an experience I simply found to be the best of that time period. Yet I still loved me some PlayStation. The sheer volume of choice here was incredible, and it would launch countless franchises that I would come to absolutely love. Here is where I'd play Soul Edge, the first game in the line of the Soul Calibur series. Here is where I'd discover Resident Evil, one of my favorite game franchises of all time. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Metal Gear Solid, Rage Racer, and countless RPGs and strategy games make up a serious contender for the best library of games ever. Much like the Sega Saturn, it also had one heck of a great library of import titles to pull from. Shoot 'em ups, fighters, and other 2D releases prospered in Japan, giving it a much more robust set of choices outside the dominant Polygon releases in the West. Many of its best games have been ported elsewhere in the years since it was on the market, but for a time, it was every bit as important to me as anything Sega had been doing. Perhaps even more so in the case of their sports games, which replaced the stuff Sega had been doing when they dropped the ball so badly in the early days of the Saturn. There are so many games on the PlayStation that it's actually tough picking just one. I'd have to go with Resident Evil 2 though. Here is where I'd play it for the first time, and sink an unbelievable amount of time into it. All 4 main scenarios, the side quests, the hidden items. I easily crammed a few hundred hours into this, trying to see every element it had to offer. It'd go on to look better on other platforms, but I played it here day one, and I'll never forget the joy it brought me. This one likely surprises many of you, but it's the Nintendo 64 that's my all-time favorite non-Sega system. I always kind of felt that it shared a kind of kinship to the Saturn in many ways. It didn't have the third-party support of the PlayStation. The hardware made developers not even attempt some types of games for it. And it has a host of exclusive titles you can't play anywhere else that are really worth your time. The library really did appeal to me right off the bat too. Super Mario 64 was an absolute revelation in game design, taking the Mario formula to a level that simply destroyed my expectations of how a game should play. Pilotwings 64 was a kind of video game vacation, a game away from a game if you will, and was a relaxing experience I could sit and play for hours on end. Zelda Ocarina of Time is in the running for one of the best games ever made, with nothing even remotely close to it in terms of design from the other systems of that generation. One area that the Nintendo 64 really hit home with me was its vast collection of awesome wrestling games. From WCW to ECW to WWF, these games remain some of my best memories of the genre. This is where these types of games really began to take off for me, thanks to their incredible creator wrestler options, 4-player co-op and competitive multiplayer, and fully licensed roster of my favorite wrestlers. It of course helps that these games took place during the Monday Night Wars, when the Attitude and NWO eras were burning bright, perhaps my favorite time as a wrestling fan. The amount of time my buddies and I spent playing these games was extreme, and easily remains some of my fondest multiplayer memories of the era. I was also quite fond of many of the racing games on the Nintendo 64, and not just the excellent stuff from Nintendo like Mario Kart 64 and Wave Race. It had a number of great arcade-inspired racers, including the San Francisco Rush titles, the Cruisin' USA series, and even the weird and wonderful Beetle Adventure Racing. Capcom even blessed the hardware with a port of Resident Evil 2, an unbelievably strong version of the game that took advantage of the system's expanded RAM upgrade for higher resolution polygon models. I couldn't bring up the Nintendo 64 without a special mention of GoldenEye either, one of the system's most potent killer apps, and a game you still can't play on any other platform. The multiplayer here gets highly touted, but I thought the single player was every bit as good. The multiple objective-based missions gave you nearly endless replay value, and no two stages were the same. I absolutely loved it. Lots of love for the Nintendo 64, and picking a favorite game isn't the easiest, but I'd go with the very first game I played, Super Mario 64. Like I said previously, this shattered what I thought was good gameplay. The way Mario moved, the way each motion led to the next, and the sheer number of things to do in the game made this a pure joy to play. The setup was easy to understand, with a hub world holding access to each stage that held stars in them that needed collecting. Once you had enough stars, you'd move on to a new area of the castle. It still amazes me that such a simple concept could be that fun, yet it was, and then some. The variety was really impressive as well. Some stages were just open playfields to run around in, some were themed with water and sunken ships, and others were fire and volcanoes. There was so much to see and do you never got tired of any of it. It's something I can still play today that holds up remarkably well. It was a watershed moment in gaming, and would influence game design on a monumental level across pretty much every related genre. What I want you guys to come away with in this episode is that every game system has something to like about it. Despite my love for the Genesis, Saturn, and Dreamcast, I was still able to find quite a bit to like about their competition and their games. I rarely found a game system that was completely without merit. I always tried to keep an open mind when it came to non-Sega games and systems, mostly because I wanted to experience everything there was to offer about the hobby, no matter who made it. I was also glad I did too, because every one of the systems and their games in this episode made my journey that much better. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.